Welcome to the Progressive Christian Bible Study. Today we are looking at two texts. The first is Psalm 1, verses 1 to 3, and then from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, verses 33 through 37. And as I always do, I want to structure this lesson around the three P's: prayer, perspective, and pieces of Scripture. And the prayer today comes from theologian Bruce Epperly in his book, Praying with Process Theology. And I like this prayer because it addresses God as gentle weaver. Awaken us, gentle weaver, to your vision of healing and happiness for myself, others, and the world. Open my heart to deeper love and my mind to greater possibilities. Help me share in your healing power and love one person at a time. And notice that prayer includes the word happiness. That brings us to the second of the three P's, perspective. And as I always do, I like to offer us a fresh or fresher perspective on the scriptures that we're looking at. And today's perspective focuses on happiness. I'm actually doing a sermon series at our church, which I started last week, on the good life. And I'm focusing on how do we live a good life in the context of so much negativity in the world right now. And so I'm looking at this topic from a variety of angles. First of all, what is a good life? How can we live a good life when calamity strikes? How do we define success in life? And today I want to look at happiness. This week I'm looking at happiness. That'll be the topic of this coming Sunday's sermon. Happiness and desire when we're thinking about the good life. So drilling down a little bit, today's perspective comes specifically from a book that I just finished reading. This is by William Irvin, and there it is. It's called A Guide to the Good Life, and it comes from the ancient Stoics. And this book is a gem of a book. It's super practical. In fact, it's one of the best books that I've read this year. It has a lot of depth because Irvin is a philosopher who is a practicing Stoic. And not only is he a practicing Stoic, but he is a student academically of the ancient Stoics. So he weaves in lots of quotes and references to Stoic writings from the past. So I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. But he writes it not for fellow academics. He writes it for non-specialists, which makes it even more enjoyable. Now, something that a lot of folks in the pews are not as familiar with, but something that New Testament scholars have known for quite some time, is that the New Testament is filled with references to Stoicism. Stoic ideas, even specific words that Stoic writers would use get borrowed by New Testament writers when they're talking about how to live, talking very, very practically. So one example of this is the New Testament letter of James. James, in one place, talks about the passions and desires that are at war within us, that unsettle us. Now, each one of those words, passions, desires, unsettling of the soul, these are Stoic ideas coming straight from writers like Epictetus and Seneca. And James is not the only writer in the New Testament that does this, though he's probably the most blatant example of using Stoic ideas, but you can find Stoic ideas in Paul's letters and elsewhere as well. There are several reasons why New Testament writers and then writers in early Christianity borrowed Stoic ideas. One reason is that imperial Stoicism, that's the Stoicism that came of age during the Roman Empire, the first century primarily, and then through the second century. In fact, in the mid-second century, the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius was a practicing Stoic. So one reason why New Testament writers seemed fond of some Stoic ideas is because imperial Stoicism reached its zenith in the ancient world right at the time when Christianity was spreading, and some early Christian writers seem to have read the Stoics. Another reason why you find Stoic ideas in New Testament and early Christianity is that Stoic ideas had a sort of common sense wisdom about them, which made their ideas palatable to all social classes. And of course, Christianity appealed to people in all social classes. And then a final reason why we find these ideas in the New Testament is that in the decades after the death of Jesus, Christianity began to shift focus from being a tiny movement that was characterized by a lot of apocalyptic zeal to a movement that was more settled, focusing on a way of life and a way of living, which necessitated adopting values that helped people in their daily lives. And of course, Stoicism was readily at hand to help them do this. Now, back to William Irvin. In one place in his book, he talks about happiness. And specifically, he raises the question of why it is that humans struggle to attain happiness. And when he engages in this conversation, he introduces two ideas that have roots in ancient Stoicism. The first is what's called hedonic adaptation. That's actually a phrase that's used by psychologists today, but it has roots in ancient Stoicism. And the other idea is called negative visualization, and that does indeed go straight back to the Stoics, like Seneca in the 1st century and then Epictetus in the early 2nd century. So what I want to do is read an excerpt from his book, and you'll hear how he defines these two ideas of hedonic adaptation and negative visualization. So here's what he writes. We humans are unhappy in large part because we are insatiable. After working hard to get what we want, we routinely lose interest in the object of our desire. Rather than feeling satisfied, we feel a bit bored. And in response to this boredom, we go on to form new, even grander desires. Psychologists who have studied this phenomenon have given it a name: hedonic adaptation. To illustrate the adaptation process, they point to studies of lottery winners. Winning a lottery typically allows someone to live the life of his dreams. It turns out, though, that after an initial period of exhilaration, lottery winners end up about as happy as they previously were. They start taking their new Ferrari and mansion for granted, the way they previously took their rusted-out pickup truck and cramped apartment for granted. Another less dramatic form of hedonic adaptation takes place when we make consumer purchases. Initially, we delight in the widescreen television or fine leather handbag we bought. After a time, though, we come to despise them and find ourselves longing for an even wider screen television or an even more extravagant handbag. Likewise, we experience hedonic adaptation in our career. We might once have dreamed of getting a certain job. We might consequently have worked hard in college and maybe graduate school as well to get on the proper career path. And on that path, we might have spent years making slow but steady progress toward our career goal. On finally landing the job of our dreams, we will be delighted. But before long, we are likely to grow dissatisfied. We might grumble about our pay, our co-workers, and the failure of our boss to recognize our talents. We also experience hedonic adaptation in our relationships. We meet the man or woman of our dreams, and after a tumultuous courtship, succeed in marrying this person. We start out in a state of wedded bliss, but before long we find ourselves contemplating our spouse's flaws, and not long after that, fantasizing about starting a relationship with someone new. As a result of the adaptation process, he says, people find themselves on a satisfaction treadmill. They are unhappy when they detect an unfulfilled desire within them. They work hard to fulfill this desire in the belief that on fulfilling it, they will gain satisfaction. The problem, though, is that once they feel satisfaction for the desire they attained, they adapt to its presence in their life and as a result stop desiring it, or at any rate, don't find it as desirable as they once did. They end up just as dissatisfied as they were before they fulfilled the desire. So now he goes on to talk about Stoic ideas. The easiest way for us to gain happiness, he says, is to learn how to want the things we already have. But how do we do it? The Stoics thought they had an answer to this question. They recommended that we spend time imagining that we have lost the things we value, that our wife has left us, our car was stolen, or we lost our job. Doing this, the Stoics thought, will make us value our wife, our car, and our job more than we otherwise would. This technique is called negative visualization. It was employed by the Stoics at least as far back as Chrysippus. It is, I think, the single most valuable technique in the Stoics' psychological toolkit. Now he's going to talk about the Roman writer Seneca, who wrote in the mid-1st century and was a Stoic. Seneca describes the negative visualization technique in the consolation he wrote to Marcia, a woman who, 3 years after the death of her son, was as grief-stricken as on the day she buried him. In this consolation, besides telling Marcia how to overcome her current grief, Seneca offers advice on how she can avoid falling victim to such grief in the future. What she needs to do is anticipate the events that can cause her to grieve. In particular, he says, she should remember that all we have is, quote, on loan from fortune, capital F, which can reclaim it without our permission. Indeed, without even advance notice. Thus, says Seneca, we should, quote, love all of our dear ones, but always with the thought that we have no promise that we may keep them forever, nay, no promise even that we may keep them for long. While enjoying the companionship of loved ones, then, we should periodically stop to reflect on the possibility that this enjoyment will come to an end. If nothing else, our own death will end it. Okay, so hedonic adaptation and negative visualization. The one talks about how our desires are never satisfied if we are seeking happiness outside ourselves in things or status or the attainment of more stuff. The other, negative visualization, offers a way to more fully appreciate what we already have by envisioning life without it. Okay, this brings us to the third of the 3 P's, and that's pieces of Scripture. And like I said before, we're looking at Psalm 1, verses 1 through 3, and then also Mark 9, verses 33 to 37. And we're looking at these 2 passages from this perspective, the perspective of happiness and the good life, and how do we appreciate the things that we have, and what actually matters most in life when we're thinking about life from the perspective of happiness. Okay, so the first passage, Psalm 1, verses 1 through 3. Happy are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or take the path that sinners tread, or sit in the seat of scoffers. But their delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law they meditate day and night. They are like trees planted by streams of water, which yield their fruit in its season, and their leaves do not wither. In all that they do, they prosper. So the first word in this psalm is happy. And because it's the first psalm in the book of Psalms, it means the first word in this entire book is happy. Now, the ancient writer responsible for this poem seems to have been wrestling with the very same question we still wrestle with. What makes us happy? Now, the word the writer uses, which is translated as happy in our English Bible, is a blessing word. Indeed, it could be translated as blessed, or it could be translated as fortunate, or, of course, translated as happy. And if we were to scan uses of this word in the Hebrew Bible, what we would find is that this word gets linked with all sorts of things. Some things that are fleeting and maybe not going to give us a permanent sense of happiness, and other things that move in that direction, move in the direction of something more permanent, something more tangible and rooted. So, for example, in the book of Genesis, one woman, Leah, she names one of her sons Asher, which is a form of the first word of Psalm 1, which means happy. So she actually names her son Happy. And she does this because she's so delighted that he was born. In the book of 1 Samuel, Hannah sings with delight at the birth of her son, Samuel. And the first 3 words of her song are, "My heart exalts." And then the book of Ecclesiastes links happiness with youthfulness. So each one of these seems to focus on momentary joy or momentary elation, the elation of the birth of your child or the enjoyment of youthfulness. But of course, both of these, when we're thinking along the lines of what Seneca is talking about, both of these are fleeting. And they're fleeting if we're thinking about happiness in terms of something deeper and more long-lasting than things that happen to us. Later on in the book of Psalms, one poet connects happiness with care for the poor and the weak. So this is an example of happiness found not in something that happens to us, like giving birth or enjoying youthfulness until you're not youthful anymore. Instead, this is an example of happiness found in doing something for others, especially those who are the least fortunate. But there are also examples in the Bible of the use of this word happy that resemble ideas in that excerpt that I read from William Irvin's book. So in the book of Proverbs, for example, it says, people are happy if they have found wisdom for living. They've basically discovered a key to life that withstands life's ups and downs and resists the insatiability of desire. And then elsewhere in the book of Ecclesiastes, the writer advises readers to, quote, be happy with what you have. So it's kind of an attitude of gratitude that appreciates what we already have in life. Now, today's psalm seems to be moving in this direction, the direction of Ecclesiastes, the direction of the book of Proverbs. Indeed, some people call Psalm 1 a wisdom psalm. Both Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are part of wisdom literature in the Bible. So Psalm 1, it resembles these aspects of wisdom literature. So again, today's psalm seems to be moving in that direction, something more rooted, something more long-lasting than happiness that just comes from desire or comes from things happening to us. So the psalmist says, happy is the person who delights in God's teaching. They, says the psalmist, recite it and murmur it day and night. It's actually what the Hebrew word means. They don't just study it, they murmur it, they meditate on it. It's constantly on their lips day and night. And interestingly, in the first verse, the psalmist basically talks about happiness in the context of not following the crowd, not walking in the way of the wicked, so to speak, or those who are misdirected in their lives, or, as William Irvin calls it, those who are misliving. The psalmist is moving in a different direction. So the person who's happy is not following the crowd in that way. And the crowd could be any group of people or any culture that seems to be moving in the direction of constantly desiring. Or the crowd could be a series of ideas about happiness, about more stuff and higher status and more prestige. A series of ideas that we know aren't going to bring true happiness in the long run. So the person who's happy moves in a different direction than the crowd. In verse 3, the psalmist says, the one who finds happiness in God's teaching, is like a tree planted by rivers of water. This is a person who thrives, has deep roots. They aren't shallow, and they don't seek happiness in shallow things that are here today and gone tomorrow. Now, the psalmist assumes that we know what this teaching of God is. And by the way, the NRSV Bible translates this word teaching as law. So the happy person is the one who delights in the law of the Lord, is how our Bible, the NRSV, translates it. The Hebrew word there, translated as law, is Torah. It could be translated as law, but it actually has a range of meanings. It's translated in all sorts of ways. And a lot of scholars prefer teaching to law in Psalm 1, because teaching is a more fluid concept. It's something that's pursued and lived instead of something that's set in stone, which isn't to say that a law set in stone is not something that's lived. Of course it is. But teaching is a more fluid concept. It doesn't have this set in stone idea. It's something that you got to go and pursue. Now, the psalmist doesn't offer specifics about what this teaching or this law is, but presumably the poet has in mind the law of Moses. But the point of the psalm, I think, is that happiness is not found in fleeting things, but in steadfast things like the law of God or the teaching of God, steadfast things that have deep roots that anchor us and help us withstand all the things in life that threaten our happiness. I'm talking about God, and there's thunder outside. I don't know if there's a connection or not. So that's Psalm 1, laying out happiness and the concept of, connected to this concept of rootedness and being like a tree planted by rivers of water. It's something that's more permanent than this endless cycle of desire. You get something and then you want something else and you want something else. The psalmist is talking about something different from that, something that gives you true happiness. So I want to move on to the second reading, which comes from Mark chapter 9. And this story, it's just a few verses 33 to 37. But I think when we're looking at it from the perspective of happiness, it gives us a kind of specific way to think about happiness, a more concrete way. So this is, again, Mark 9, verses 33 through 37. When they came to Capernaum, and when Jesus was in the house, he had asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But the disciples were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. Jesus sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then Jesus took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." I think this is an interesting text to include in a discussion about happiness and the good life, because we get here an object lesson about how striving for status, something folks might include in a definition of happiness is more status. But striving for status is made to look silly in this story, because the disciples are presented in this story as petty. Verse 34, they're arguing with each other about which one of them was the greatest. And being a preacher and also being a dad, I like to weave in some corny jokes occasionally. I find it interesting that they're arguing about which one of them was the greatest, because didn't Muhammad Ali say he was the greatest? Now that Greek word, the greatest or greatest, comes from a Greek root, mega, which is a word that has several meanings, but here has the sense of greatest in rank and dignity. They're arguing with each other over who is the greatest in rank, who has the most dignity, the most status in and among the disciples. They're basically arguing about honor. Who deserves the most honor among us? The position of authority, or the best place at the dinner table. Which one of us is the mega disciple? Jesus calls them out for this. And he offers an object lesson of his own that helps, I think, to fill in a little bit this picture of happiness. So he sits them all down and he tells them, whoever wants to be first must be last of all, and also servant of all. Now that word last can also mean least of all, the person who takes the most inferior seat at the dinner table, not the place of honor. So if you want to be greatest in terms of honor, he says, seek to be the least in terms of honor. So he's flipping the whole honor code system on its head. The ancient world was an honor-shame system where you would constantly strive to acquire more honor. You could be born into a position of honor if your parents were aristocrats, for example, but you would still spend your life trying to acquire honor relative to your peers. And it was a zero-sum game. The more honor you had meant less honor for someone else, or greater shame for someone else. So it's not surprising the disciples in this context are having this discussion. It's disappointing, and possibly Jesus was disappointed with them, but it's not surprising because it's an honor-shame culture, and they're constantly thinking in terms of status, not unlike people in our day. So Jesus says, not just seeking to be the least of all, but also seeking to be the servant of all. And that Greek word serve gets translated as servant is where we get our word diaconate from. It's basically a term that means be the waiter, be the server, because originally that word in the book of Acts was used for people who waited at table. So be the server, be the waiter of all. Now, this teaching is consistent with much of what Jesus does in his ministry, because you think about the interactions he has with people. He is constantly striving to include more and more the least and the lost and the left out, bringing them into the fold and giving them honor. Now, what Jesus does after he teaches this little wisdom saying to the disciples, he then does an object lesson of his own, where he calls a child over, has the child stand before these disciples, and then Mark just adds a little nuance, saying Jesus embraced the child, he hugged the child, but then he has the child stand there as an object lesson because he wants to teach these disciples a lesson. So he embraces the child, and then he tells the disciples to be welcomers of children. Now, children is really a metaphor here. It's a symbol for anyone who is least and lost and left out. It's potent stuff, this teaching of Jesus, because children in many places in the ancient world, unlike how children are often treated today, we tend to prize and privilege children today, but in the ancient world, and in many settings in the ancient world, children were the least significant members of the family. Infant and child mortality rates in the ancient world were quite high. Another child for a poor peasant meant another mouth you had to feed. Children were too young to have acquired honor of their own, and they were not able to dole out gifts to others, which is one of the signs of honor in the ancient world, your ability to give gifts or give good things to others. So children are not in a place to do any of that. They can't acquire honor, they can't give in the way that an adult can. So their place was the least in the family and in the social context. So Jesus is being very deliberate here in pulling a child in front of them to do this object lesson, because he's highlighting the least among people in the social environment, the least is the one who you should pay attention to, who you should welcome. So Jesus says, if you want to be great, mega. If you want to be happy, to weave in the theme for this week, seek out and embrace the world's quote-unquote children, the least, the lost, and the left out. To put that slightly differently, happiness is not found in striving and attaining for me. The selfish struggle for happiness is not found, or the selfish struggle for happiness that's driven by personal desire leads to hedonic adaptation. Striving for me to acquire leads to hedonic adaptation. You're just going to have to adapt. Now you're going to get used to it and you're going to want more. The desire cycle never quite ends. So again, the more we have, the more we want, and it never ends. But Jesus in this story points in a different direction when we're thinking about what he's doing in terms of this perspective of happiness. What he's doing is something like, we become happier when we live in such a way that everyone around us can be happier, especially the least and the lost and the left out, the, again, quote-unquote, children. So he's thinking here in terms of the collective. And that also is an interesting insight, because as much as honor-shame was a potent cultural force in the ancient world, so also was collectivism. Not individualism, but collectivism. So in a way, what he's doing is taking a different cultural value from the ancient world and moving it ahead in priority over honor and shame. He's not destroying the honor-shame system. He's just flipping it on its head. And he's bringing this other cultural value of collectivism and saying, this is the priority. So it's not just happiness for me or honor for me or acquiring for me. That leads to hedonic adaptation. Instead, it's happiness for us, and especially those for whom happiness is a constant battle, because they are the least, the lost, and the left out. So what he's offering here is a more collective vision of happiness. It's happiness for all instead of just happiness for me.